So here's our very first fit-space tutorial, and apparently it's a window inside my head. How is it that I use literature to try and create a prompt book? And that's part of user research. So today we're going to talk about searching for literature on a core construct, all to prepare you to go out into the field. And we're going to first start by talking about how I search for things, then how I prioritize the things I read, and then how I organize that into a prompt book. So when it comes to searching, my very first thing is to use the old dictionary. So if the problem that I am after is, let's say, too many fit-space fellows are feeling overwhelmed, then the construct or the concept that's behind that problem statement is overwhelmed. And so I would just type that into dictionary.com, and you'll see that I get a whole bunch of different definitions. And they help to give me some keywords. So the first definition, to overcome completely in mind or feeling, gives me two different directions to search for literature. Mind, that's about cognition. That's about what happens up there. Feelings are about emotions. And so those are two different avenues to explore. The second thing that I do is once I start to extract some keywords like mind or feeling, then I can start to use some of those keywords in a database to find literature. And so I might go to something like Google Scholar and I might type in feeling overwhelmed and see what comes up from that. I might start to put bounds on my search, feeling overwhelmed at work. So I might put a context around that. So already here, compassion fatigue and burnout is already an article that might be interesting to look at. Or teachers, physical, mental, and emotional burnout. So again, you're starting to see three different things you could search for: physical versus mental versus emotional. All of that might be different ways to start to create literature that's really useful. Now, how do you prioritize all this stuff? I mean, there's like hundreds of thousands of articles and things that come back from it. That's where I start to think quite concretely. I need to find a way to explain these concepts to the user so that they know what I'm talking about. And sometimes visual imagery is better to do that than words. So in that third definition on dictionary.com of overwhelmed, floodwaters, debris, and avalanche are all used as kind of proxies for what it feels like to be overwhelmed. Well, what if we created a set of visual prompt cards that helped people to talk about what it's like to feel overwhelmed without actually having to name it? So I might just go into Google Images and I might create a picture book of all of these different natural disasters. And maybe I bring that with me when I'm on my field work. And I ask people to talk about, when you feel overwhelmed, do any of these images come to mind? And use that to talk about a concrete example of when they felt overwhelmed. The second thing I often do in order to prioritize literature is when I'm reading, I'm looking for a number of different things. I'm looking for the causes or the symptoms of something. So when I go back to my Google search, and I might sort of say feeling overwhelmed at work, and I might search for something like causes. And here, exploring causes of principal burnout is a really interesting one. And I might also look for the symptoms of it. And so how do you know somebody is feeling overwhelmed? All of these give me different prompt words that I can use. So if there is a set of symptoms that are out there for things, then I can use that to ask more informed questions or to look for those things when I'm out observing. I also often look at determinants. So determinants are like, well, what are all the sets of factors that might influence whether somebody feels being overwhelmed? And so I often type into Google Scholar determinants of, and then being overwhelmed or being bored or being isolated, whatever is your core construct. And you'll already see here there's psychological determinants of occupational burnout. That's probably a really great article that has some of these different features or factors that influence whether somebody reports being burned out. And those different features or factors are all things that I might be able to look for when I'm out observing or that I might ask somebody about. Then the third way I try to prioritize information is by looking for like user groups. So if we're doing a study of what it's like to feel overwhelmed in the fit space, then I might be looking for contexts that are like the fit space. So professional development contexts. So I might sort of search determinants or being overwhelmed and then kind of learning and professional development. And inside the black box, so this is about some stuff that might be happening in classrooms, mindful practice, building a sense of something out. That's not turning up anything that's that interesting, so I might say being overwhelmed, and what are other like things. So yeah, teachers or principals is probably, those are people that are kind of like what you're going through at the moment in the fifth space. So maybe I can extract concepts that are relevant. So then you start to see a lot of stuff that's about teacher isolation and alienation, how to help beginning teachers succeed. You could liken fifth space fellows to being a beginning kind of teacher, first sort of learning about something. And so those articles might prove to be more useful. Yeah, being overwhelmed at work and staff. So staff is another word that might be a trigger for a like context or user group. So then we've got all of this stuff. We've got some metaphors, we've got imagery, we've got causes, we've got user groups. The question is, you now need to ask yourself the question, so what? What does this tell me about what I can observe of somebody in the moment? So if being overwhelmed happens in certain contexts, how can I go to those contexts and see somebody when they are actually feeling overwhelmed? So I get really overwhelmed when I'm in a lot of traffic. So how could somebody come observe me in the moment when I'm driving in a lot of traffic and see, how does my body respond? How does my language respond? What do I do? What do I talk about? The second thing is, what can I actually ask somebody to see in order to see evidence of being overwhelmed? So that's when I might ask them to take out a calendar and show me in the last week points of their days in which they felt really overwhelmed or not at all overwhelmed. I might ask to see pictures, like, can you show me times of your life when it was more overwhelming or not? Or artifacts, can you take me on a little tour of your house of things that remind you of times when you weren't overwhelmed and when it was like great times versus times when you were quite daunted? And I might try from using those really concrete examples to help them extrapolate what are the differences for them in terms of when they are and when they're not. And lastly, I might look for how to dig deeper into any of these things. So what could I look for over time? Could I ask somebody to record for me over the next 2 weeks moments in which they feel super overwhelmed? Could I call people at particular times of day over the next few weeks and just check in at that point at which they're likely to feel overwhelmed? Can I look at their language over time and notice any patterns? So this is where, ethnographic methods aren't designed to just be a one-off experience, but you need to start to think about what could you look at multiple points in time in order to build a picture up of somebody and see how they're reacting to certain events. So all of this comes together into a prompt book. And so this is an example of a prompt pad that we created for the Burnaby Starter Project. And in it, we just put all of the things we're curious about. So all of this research that I just did, all of these questions I have, I kind of put it all together as a way when I'm out in the field to remind myself, oh yes, I wanted to ask about this, or I wanted to observe this, or maybe I need to bring with me a set of pictures in order to trigger some sort of conversation. So if we were to make a prompt book for feeling overwhelmed, then what I would do is start to use some words like this. So being overwhelmed. The first thing I might say is, well, when and where do people feel overwhelmed? And so this is a trigger for me to figure out, well, in the last week, when did somebody feel overwhelmed? And that's where using a calendar might be really helpful, or drawing a calendar. In the last year, maybe they could show me photos, or maybe they could show me objects in their house that remind me of points of time in which they were overwhelmed or not. And so that's a reminder for me to show me places. Maybe they can actually take me on a tour of the places where they feel overwhelmed. Or maybe they can show me reminders or artifacts of that. And maybe they can help show me what stuff that they constantly feel overwhelmed about that reoccurs, and what were moments of time which were particularly overwhelming for some situational factors. I might want to look at the symptoms of, like, how, for them, what does it look like when they're overwhelmed? And so starting with the concrete, can they identify a moment in the last week, and how did they know they were overwhelmed? Can they self-record something that's happening? Can I give them a prompt to ask over the next week? Record yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed. Or can I come along? Can I ask them to come along to a point when they're overwhelmed? For triggers, I might want to use some prompt words or metaphors. So maybe I have some pictures of different places where people might feel overwhelmed. And that's what those different contexts are. Maybe if I show people a picture of their car or the grocery store or their workplace, it will prompt them into thinking about, oh yes, I really feel overwhelmed in these places versus those. We're always really interested in people's own solutions. That's part of what we're looking for when we do ethnography, is people already have come up with some interesting workarounds for themselves. So get me to show you some of those. Like, when you're feeling overwhelmed, where do you go? And show me that place in your house. What do you watch? What DVDs do you watch? What TV stations do you do? What music do you listen to? Who do you call on the phone? I'm trying to get a really tangible sense of their go-to places or mechanisms. What do they find comforting when they are in this state of being overwhelmed? What do they find helpful versus unhelpful? So, you know, is it really unhelpful to them to have somebody come and talk to them about stuff? Or do they find it really helpful to have a confidant or a friend? We're trying to gain all this information so we can learn how to intervene. What is it that we can design or build to make people feel less overwhelmed? And finally, that's what those hooks are there. So, you know, a good ethnographic researcher is somebody that is looking for the opportunities to intervene. So if somebody finds it really comforting to have a conversational partner when they're overwhelmed, then that's something I'm starting to take note of. Maybe I could design something around that. Or what are people's existing interests? Maybe they love sports, and sports is the thing that makes them feel less overwhelmed. I want to note that. Maybe it's TV. Maybe it is cooking. And I want to figure out what are the natural points in people's existing environments where I might be able to insert something new to help them with this feeling of overwhelmedness. So what we're hoping with as you guys go out is for you to begin to take your core construct and unpick it. Look at it from different angles. Ask people new kinds of questions. Observe without asking. See artifacts, see photos, see calendars, and try and build up a rich picture of that person.